The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Robert's tomato garden, and Josephine Smith could almost convince herself he was still there, just around the corner of the house, probably checking the rain gauge he'd installed near the back porch. 6 months had passed since cancer took him from her, yet she still found herself setting 2 coffee cups each morning, still turning to share a thought with empty air. She knelt beside the raised beds he'd built with his carpenter's hands, her fingers working the soil around the basil plants. The wedding ring on her left hand caught the sunlight, the antique diamond sending small rainbows dancing across the dirt. 3 generations of love had worn the gold band smooth. First Robert's grandmother Margaret, then his mother Helen, and for 45 years, her own hand had never known its absence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You'd be proud of the garden, she whispered to the silence. Though I still can't get the spacing right on the carrots like you did. The sound of car doors slamming pulled her from her reverie. Through the kitchen window, she glimpsed her daughter-in-law Cassandra's silver BMW, its pristine paint gleaming against the backdrop of their modest Connecticut neighborhood. Grace emerged from the passenger side, her 16-year-old frame unfolding with the easy grace of youth, while Cassandra checked her reflection in the side mirror before approaching. Josephine brushed the soil from her gardening gloves and stood, her knees protesting the movement. At 68, her body reminded her daily of time's passage, though her mind remained sharp as the day she'd first shelved books in the town library. "Grandma Jo." Grace's voice carried genuine warmth as she bounded around the house. "Mom said we should check on you. Make sure you're eating properly." Cassandra followed at a more measured pace, her designer heels clicking against the flagstone path Robert had laid stone by stone during their 2nd year of marriage. "Hello, Josephine. You look like you've been gardening." There was something in her daughter-in-law's tone, a careful politeness that didn't quite mask an underlying calculation. In 15 years of marriage to Michael, Cassandra had perfected the art of appearing concerned, while somehow making Josephine feel judged. "Robert always said idle hands were the devil's workshop," Josephine replied, pulling off her gloves. "Would you like some iced tea?" "Grace, honey, there's leftover apple pie in the kitchen." They settled on the back porch, where Robert's rocking chair still sat at the perfect angle to catch the evening breeze. Cassandra perched on the edge of the wicker love seat, her posture suggesting this wasn't a social call, despite the friendly pretense. "The house is so quiet," Cassandra observed, her eyes sweeping across the familiar space. "Don't you find it overwhelming? All this space for just one person?" Grace shot her mother a sharp look that Josephine caught but pretended not to notice. The girl had always been perceptive, old beyond her years, in ways that reminded Josephine of herself at that age. "I find comfort in the familiar," Josephine said carefully. "Your grandfather and I chose every piece of furniture together, planned every room. It would feel wrong to change things now." Of course. Cassandra's smile was bright and empty. "But practically speaking, there must be so much to manage. Bills, maintenance, all those decisions Robert used to handle. And then there's the question of, valuable items, family heirlooms that need proper care." The conversation was taking a turn Josephine hadn't expected, though something in Cassandra's manner suggested this was the real reason for the visit. Grace had grown very still, her attention focused intently on her mother's words. "I manage just fine," Josephine said, though she kept her voice gentle. "Sarah helps with anything I can't handle myself." "Sarah." Cassandra's tone sharpened almost imperceptibly. "She means well, but she lives 2 hours away. She can't be here for the day-to-day concerns. And frankly, some decisions require a more practical perspective." Josephine's hand moved instinctively to the ring, twisting it around her finger in a gesture that had become unconscious over the decades. The movement didn't escape Cassandra's notice. "Actually, that's something I wanted to discuss." Cassandra leaned forward, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when explaining why her wishes should supersede everyone else's. "That ring, Josephine. It's beautiful, obviously, and clearly valuable. But dead people don't need jewelry. The words hung in the air like a slap. Grace's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Josephine felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. In all her years of navigating Cassandra's subtle manipulations and backhanded comments, nothing had prepared her for such casual cruelty. "I beg your pardon?" Josephine's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "The ring belonged to Robert's family, which makes it Michael's inheritance, really. And Grace will need something special for her future engagement." Cassandra's smile never wavered. "It should stay in the family for future generations, not just sit on the finger of, well, someone who doesn't really need it anymore." Josephine looked down at the ring that had marked every milestone of her adult life. She'd worn it through pregnancies and childbirth, through Robert's cancer treatments and recovery, through their children's graduations and weddings. It had been blessed by their minister when they renewed their vows on their 25th anniversary, had caught wedding cake when Grace was baptized, had been kissed by Robert every morning for 45 years. "This ring," Josephine said quietly, "was given to me by my husband. It represents our marriage, our commitment, our life together. Robert specifically told me it should remain mine until I choose its next recipient." Cassandra's expression shifted, the mask of concern slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "Josephine, I understand you're still grieving, but you need to think practically. That's at least a 3-carat diamond, probably worth $20,000 or more. It's irresponsible to keep something so valuable unworn and uninsured when it could benefit the family." "Mom," Grace said quietly, her voice tight with embarrassment. "Maybe we should." "Grace, honey, adults are talking." Cassandra didn't take her eyes off Josephine. "I'm just trying to look out for everyone's interests." Robert would have wanted his family taken care of. Something crystallized in Josephine's chest, a clarity she hadn't felt since Robert's diagnosis. She recognized the manipulation now, the way Cassandra framed her greed as concern, her demands as reasonableness. For years, she'd bent to keep peace, had swallowed smaller slights to avoid confrontation. But this was sacred ground. "No," Josephine said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "The answer is no." Cassandra blinked, clearly not having expected such direct refusal. "I'm sorry?" "I said no. This ring stays on my hand where my husband placed it 45 years ago, where it belongs." Josephine stood, her spine straight, despite the tremor in her hands. "I think it's time for you to leave." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace's eyes were wide with something that might have been admiration, while Cassandra's face cycled through shock, anger, and finally a cold calculation that made Josephine's skin crawl. "I see," Cassandra said finally, rising with deliberate grace. "I hope you'll reconsider when you're thinking more clearly. Family harmony is important, Josephine, more important than clinging to the past." As they left, Josephine caught Grace's backward glance, apologetic, troubled, and somehow proud. But it was Cassandra's parting look that stayed with her long after the BMW disappeared down the street. It was the look of someone who had been refused something they considered rightfully theirs, and who had no intention of accepting that refusal. Standing alone in the gathering dusk, Josephine touched the ring that had become so much a part of her she'd forgotten its weight. Robert's voice seemed to whisper on the evening breeze. "You did right, Josie. You stood your ground." For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. But something cold settled in her stomach as she watched the taillights disappear. This wasn't over. Cassandra's final look had promised that much. The sound of car doors slamming again made Josephine turn from where she stood on the porch. Cassandra's BMW hadn't even reached the end of the street before it was reversing back into the driveway, its engine cutting through the evening quiet like an accusation. Cassandra emerged first, her composure intact but something different in her movements, a tightness around her eyes, a deliberate quality to her steps. Grace followed more slowly, clearly reluctant, her teenage frame seeming to shrink with each step toward the house. "I'm sorry," Cassandra called out, her voice carrying across the yard with practiced sweetness. I realized I forgot my purse. And honestly, Josephine, I think we left things on such an awkward note. That's not how families should part. Josephine remained on the porch, her hands still resting on the spot where her ring lay beneath her sweater. Your purse is on the kitchen counter, she said simply. But Cassandra was already moving past her into the house, Grace trailing behind with an apologetic glance. Thank you. And while I'm here, perhaps we could finish our conversation properly. I feel like there was some misunderstanding. In the living room, Cassandra settled herself on the sofa with the familiarity of 15 years of family gatherings. But her posture was different now, more centered, more purposeful. Grace perched on the edge of the opposite chair, her discomfort palpable. Josephine, please sit. Cassandra's tone had shifted to something softer, more concerned. I think my approach earlier was too direct. I know how difficult this time has been for you. Josephine remained standing, recognizing something in Cassandra's manner that set her teeth on edge. This was different from the earlier demand, more careful, more calculated. The thing is, Cassandra continued, reaching into her designer handbag and pulling out a tissue she didn't need. I've been so worried about you since Robert's passing. We all have. Living alone in this big house, managing everything by yourself. It's natural that grief might cloud judgment sometimes. The words were gentle, but they landed like small stones thrown with precision. Josephine felt each one, understood their purpose. My judgment is perfectly clear, Josephine said quietly. Of course. But you have to understand how it looks from the outside. Cassandra's eyes glistened with moisture that seemed to appear on command. When someone refuses to consider what's best for the family, when they cling to material possessions instead of thinking about future generations, well, people worry. Grace shifted uncomfortably. Mom, maybe we should. Grace, honey, let the adults talk. Cassandra's voice carried a warning wrapped in silk. This is important family business. Josephine watched the interaction with growing clarity. She'd seen variations of this dynamic before. Cassandra's subtle but unmistakable command, Grace's retreat into silence. How many times had she herself been silenced in similar ways over the years? Robert would have wanted the ring to benefit the family, Cassandra continued, her voice taking on a tremulous quality. He was such a practical man, so generous. He would never have wanted something so valuable to just sit unused when it could help secure Grace's future or contribute to the family's financial stability. The mention of Robert's name in service of this manipulation sent a flash of anger through Josephine's chest. Robert made his wishes about the ring very clear to me before he died. But surely he couldn't have anticipated how difficult this would be for you, how attached you'd become. Cassandra leaned forward, her expression a masterpiece of sympathetic concern. Grief can make us hold on to things that aren't healthy to hold on to. It's natural, but it's not always what's best. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Josephine felt the familiar pressure to smooth things over, to find a compromise that would restore peace. For decades, she'd been the family's diplomatic core, the one who bent so others wouldn't have to break. But something had crystallized during that first refusal on the porch, a recognition of a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The ring stays with me, Josephine said, her voice steady. That was Robert's wish, and it's my right. Cassandra's expression flickered, just for a moment, before the mask of concern reasserted itself. Josephine, I understand you feel strongly about this, but you're not thinking clearly. The stress of widowhood, the isolation, the financial pressures of maintaining this house alone, it's affecting your decision-making. My decision-making is fine. Is it? Cassandra's voice carried a note of gentle challenge. Because from where I sit, this seems like an older woman clinging to the past instead of thinking about her family's future. What happens if you fall, if you have an accident? What if that ring gets lost or stolen? What if you forget where you put it? Each question was a small blow, designed to chip away at Josephine's confidence in her own competence. But instead of the intended effect, they sparked something protective and fierce in her chest. I'm 68, not 98, Josephine said, her voice carrying an edge that surprised them both. "I'm perfectly capable of caring for my own possessions." "Of course you are, under normal circumstances. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they? You've suffered a tremendous loss. You're alone, vulnerable, probably not sleeping well, possibly not eating properly. These things affect judgment, Josephine. It's nothing to be ashamed of." Grace made a small sound of distress. "Mom, please." "Grace." The single word from Cassandra carried enough weight to silence her daughter completely. Josephine watched this exchange with dawning recognition. This wasn't just about the ring. This was about power, about control, about who got to make decisions, and who had to accept the vibaya. For 15 years, she'd watched Cassandra manage family dynamics with surgical precision, always getting her way while making it seem reasonable, even inevitable. "You're suggesting I'm mentally incompetent," Josephine said, her voice quiet but clear. "I'm suggesting you're grieving and possibly not thinking as clearly as you normally would. There's a difference." Cassandra's tone remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. "Michael is concerned too. He's been worried about your emotional state, your ability to handle complex decisions." The mention of her son hit its mark. Josephine felt a stab of betrayal, quickly followed by a surge of protective anger. "Michael expressed concern about my mental state?" "He loves you, Josephine. We all do. That's why this is so difficult. Sometimes loving someone means making hard decisions for their own good." The presumption in those words, the casual assumption of authority over Josephine's life and choices, crystallized everything that had been building in her chest since Cassandra's return. "No," Josephine said, and this time her voice carried a strength that seemed to fill the room. "No one makes decisions for my own good except me. The ring was left to me, by my husband, with explicit instructions that I keep it until I choose otherwise. That choice is mine alone." Cassandra's carefully constructed expression began to crack. "You're being selfish, Josephine. This isn't just about you anymore. There's Grace's future to consider, the family's financial security. The family's financial security is not my responsibility to provide through my jewelry." "It's not your jewelry." The words burst out before Cassandra could stop them, her mask finally slipping completely. "It belonged to Robert's family. It should go to Robert's son, to his son's family. You're just the temporary keeper of it." The room fell silent except for Grace's sharp intake of breath. Cassandra seemed to realize what she'd revealed, but it was too late. The truth of her feelings hung in the air between them, naked and ugly. "I see," Josephine said quietly. "So in your view, my 45-year marriage to Robert made me merely a temporary keeper of his family's possessions." Cassandra tried to backtrack. "That's not what I meant." "I think it's exactly what you meant." Josephine's voice was calm, but there was something unshakable in it now. "And I think this conversation is over. Josephine, please, let's not leave things like this. Family harmony is so important, especially now. If you could just consider—" "I have considered. My answer is no, and it will remain no." Josephine moved toward the front door with purposeful steps. "I think it's time for you to leave." Again. Cassandra stood, her composure fraying at the edges. "Fine. But this isn't over, Josephine. There are people who care about your welfare, who won't just stand by and watch you make decisions that aren't in your best interest. Michael will want to discuss this with you. Sarah too, probably. The whole family will need to be involved." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably a threat. Josephine felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized the shape of what was coming, a campaign designed to isolate her, to present her as incompetent, to build a case for why others should make her decisions. "Are you threatening me?" Josephine asked. "I'm expressing concern for a family member who may not be thinking clearly. There's a difference." Cassandra gathered her purse and moved toward the door, Grace following silently. "I hope you'll reconsider before this becomes a larger family issue." At the threshold, Cassandra turned back, her expression a mixture of frustration and calculation. "You know, Josephine, Robert always said you were the most stubborn woman he'd ever met. I used to think he meant it fondly." The barb was designed to wound, And it did. But it also clarified something for Josephine. The realization that this woman had never truly respected her, had been waiting for the opportunity to strip away whatever authority and dignity she possessed. As the BMW pulled away for the second time, Josephine stood in her doorway and felt the weight of what had just occurred. The conversation had revealed fault lines in her family that she'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Cassandra's parting words echoed in her mind, carrying the implicit promise of a campaign to come. But underneath her fear, something else burned steady and bright, a determination that surprised her with its strength. She touched the ring through her sweater and whispered to the empty air, "I know what you really meant when you called me stubborn, Robert. And right now I'm grateful for every bit of it." The war for her dignity had officially begun. Josephine closed the front door and leaned against it, her heart still racing from the confrontation. The house felt different now, not the sanctuary of memories it had been that morning, but something more like a fortress. She could still hear the echo of Cassandra's parting threat about involving the whole family, and she understood with crystalline clarity that this was only the beginning. 20 miles away, Cassandra sat in her BMW outside the local Starbucks, her phone pressed to her ear as it rang once, twice, 3 times before Michael's familiar voice answered. "Hey, hon, how's Mom doing?" Cassandra took a carefully measured breath, her voice carrying just the right note of concern mixed with exhaustion. "Oh, Michael, I'm so glad you answered. I'm really worried about her." "What happened? Is she okay?" "Physically, yes. But emotionally." Cassandra paused, letting the silence carry weight. "I think the isolation is affecting her more than we realized. She's becoming very attached to material things. Irrational about them, really." Michael's voice sharpened with attention. "What do you mean?" "I mentioned that it might be wise to think about securing some of the more valuable family heirlooms. You know, proper insurance, maybe storing them safely." "And she became very agitated about your grandmother's ring. Very defensive. Almost paranoid." In the background, Cassandra could hear the familiar sounds of Michael's accounting office. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the mundane soundtrack of his predictable life. "Paranoid how?" "She accused me of trying to steal from her, Michael." "Me?" "After 15 years of being part of this family." Cassandra's voice carried a tremor of hurt that was perfectly calibrated. "I'm just concerned about her financial security, about making sure valuable items are properly protected, and she reacted like I was some kind of predator." Michael was quiet for a moment, and Cassandra could picture him running his hand through his thinning hair the way he did when stressed. "That doesn't sound like Mom." "That's exactly what worries me. It doesn't sound like her at all. The isolation, the grief, I think it's affecting her judgment more than any of us realized. She's so focused on holding on to everything of your father's that she can't think practically about the future. Maybe she's just not ready to think about those things yet." Cassandra had anticipated this response. Michael's instinct was always to avoid conflict, to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Usually, she found this quality useful. Today, it was an obstacle. Of course she's not ready. That's the problem. She's making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. "Michael, that ring is worth at least $20,000. Maybe more. She's keeping it in an unsecured jewelry box in a house where she lives alone. What if something happens to her? What if she falls or has a medical emergency? What if the house is broken into?" Each scenario was delivered with escalating concern, building a picture of vulnerability and poor judgment. "I hadn't thought about the security aspect," Michael admitted. "And then there's Grace's future to consider. That ring has been in your family for generations. Shouldn't it go to the next generation when the time is right? Your mother is in her late 60s, Michael. She could live another 20 years, but what if she doesn't? What if her mental state continues to decline?" The phrase mental state was dropped carefully into the conversation, a seed planted for future germination. Meanwhile, back in the house on Maple Street, Josephine moved through the rooms Robert had built with deliberate slowness, seeing them with new eyes. Everything felt more precious now, more worth defending. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, her hand trailing along the banister Robert had sanded and stained himself. In the master bedroom, she opened the bottom drawer of Robert's dresser, the one she hadn't touched since his death. Beneath his neatly folded sweaters, she found what she was looking for, the small wooden box where he'd kept important papers. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. There, in Robert's careful carpenter's handwriting, was the letter he'd written during his final week. She'd read it once, at the lawyer's office, but grief had made the words blur together. Now, with Cassandra's threats fresh in her mind, every word came into sharp focus. "My dearest Josie," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're dealing with all the practical matters I should have handled better while I was here. First, and most important, the ring that belonged to my grandmother Margaret is yours now, completely and forever. Wear it, treasure it, or put it in a drawer if that brings you comfort. The choice of what happens to it next is yours alone to make, when and if you choose to make it. Don't let anyone pressure you into decisions about things that matter to you. You've spent too many years putting everyone else's comfort before your own." The words seemed to shimmer on the page. Robert had known her so well, had understood her tendency to smooth over conflicts, even at her own expense. But he'd also seen something in her that she was only now beginning to recognize, a strength that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Back in the Starbucks parking lot, Cassandra was building toward her closing argument. "I'm not saying we need to have her declared incompetent or anything dramatic like that. I'm just saying someone needs to have a gentle conversation with her about thinking more practically, about what's best for the family as a whole." "Maybe Sarah should talk to her," Michael suggested, and Cassandra's grip tightened on the phone. "Sarah lives 2 hours away, honey. She can visit once a month and see the best side of things. She doesn't see your mother on a daily basis, doesn't see the small signs of decline. And honestly, Sarah has always been a little protective of your mother. Sometimes protectiveness can prevent us from seeing what's really going on." Michael sighed. "So what are you suggesting?" "Just that you visit her. Soon. Talk to her about practical matters. Insurance, security, planning for the future. See for yourself how she reacts. I think you'll be shocked by how defensive and irrational she's become about material possessions." Quote, "I can probably stop by this weekend." "That would be perfect. And Michael, try to bring up the ring specifically. You'll see what I mean about her attachment being unhealthy." After hanging up, Cassandra sat for a moment in her car, mentally reviewing the conversation. She'd planted the necessary seeds: concerns about Josephine's mental state, the financial irresponsibility of keeping valuable items unsecured, the need for family intervention. Michael would visit his mother with these ideas already in his head, would interpret anything through the lens of concern and worry. At the same time, Josephine was carefully folding Robert's letter and placing it back in its box. But she kept one paragraph out, copying it onto a small piece of paper that she tucked into her wallet. The words felt like armor. "The choice of what happens to it next is yours alone to make, when and if you choose to make it. Don't let anyone pressure you into decisions about things that matter to you." A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Pat Williams standing on the porch with a covered dish and a determined expression. Pat had been her neighbor and closest friend for 30 years. They'd raised their children together, weathered husbands' illnesses together, and supported each other through the hard seasons of life. "I brought chicken casserole," Pat announced as Josephine opened the door. "And I want to hear about whatever has you looking like you've been through a war." They settled in the kitchen, where the late afternoon light cast familiar shadows across the table where Josephine and Robert had shared thousands of meals. Pat waited until they both had coffee before fixing Josephine with the direct stare that had intimidated 3 decades of 7th graders. "Talk," Pat said simply. Josephine found herself telling the whole story: Cassandra's visit, the demand for the ring, the manipulative return visit with its veiled threats about family intervention. Pat listened without interrupting, her expression growing progressively darker. "That calculating little witch," Pat said when Josephine finished. "I've been watching her operate for 15 years, and I've been waiting for her to finally overplay her hand. She says the family will need to be involved, that there will be discussions about my judgment, my mental state. Pat's laugh was sharp and humorless. Oh, honey. She's going to try to turn everyone against you by making them think you're losing your marbles. It's textbook manipulation. Isolate the target, create doubt about their competence. Position yourself as the reasonable one just trying to help. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Have you seen this before? In 30 years of teaching, I dealt with parents who used every trick in the book to get their way. Cassandra's type always follows the same playbook. First, they make reasonable-sounding requests. When that doesn't work, they escalate to emotional manipulation, tears, guilt, invoking family loyalty. When that fails, they go for character assassination, suggesting the target is mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, or selfishly holding back the family's best interests. Josephine felt a chill of recognition. She's already started, hasn't she? The phone calls, the concerns about my mental state. Almost certainly. Michael's probably already gotten a call full of worried concern about your irrational attachment to material possessions. What do I do? Pat reached across the table and covered Josephine's hand with her own. You document everything. You gather your allies. And you prepare for a fight. Because, honey, this is war now. But here's the thing about bullies like Cassandra. They're used to people backing down. They don't know how to handle it when someone stands their ground. I feel like I'm tearing the family apart. No, Pat said firmly. She's tearing the family apart. You're just refusing to be steamrolled anymore. There's a difference. As Pat spoke, Josephine felt something settling into place inside her chest. A resolution that was part determination and part relief. For too many years, she'd been the family's shock absorber, smoothing over conflicts and swallowing her own needs to keep peace. But peace built on one person's constant capitulation wasn't really peace at all. Robert's letter says the choice about the ring is mine alone, Josephine said quietly. Then that's the end of it. Legally, morally, and practically. Pat's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with entitled people who thought rules didn't apply to them. Now let's figure out how to make sure everyone else understands that. Outside, the sun was setting over the neighborhood where Josephine had lived her entire adult life. But inside the kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of true friendship and the strength of righteous purpose, she felt more alive than she had in months. The campaign against her had begun, but she was no longer the passive, grief-stricken widow Cassandra thought she was targeting. She was a woman with allies, with documentation, and with the growing conviction that some fights were worth having. Let them come. The casserole dish sat empty between them, and Pat was helping Josephine clear the table when headlights swept across the kitchen window. Both women turned to see Michael's familiar Honda Civic pulling into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Well, Pat said quietly, setting down the dish towel. That was faster than I expected. Josephine felt her stomach tighten. Less than 3 hours had passed since Cassandra's departure, which meant the phone call had happened quickly. Should I ask you to stay? Only if you want me to. But honey, this is a conversation you and Michael need to have alone. He's a good man underneath all that conflict avoidance. Give him a chance to see the truth. Pat gathered her things and slipped out the back door just as Michael's footsteps sounded on the front porch. Josephine took a steadying breath and opened the door before he could knock. Hi, sweetheart. She kept her voice warm despite the tension coiling in her chest. This is a nice surprise. Michael stood on the threshold, his tie loosened and his usually neat hair slightly disheveled. At 40, he still carried himself with the careful posture of a man who'd learned early that staying quiet and accommodating usually kept him out of trouble. But tonight, something in his manner suggested internal conflict. Hi, Mom. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. See how you're doing? It was a gentle lie. Michael's accounting firm was 20 minutes away, and he never worked late on Wednesdays. But Josephine didn't challenge it. Instead, she ushered him into the living room where, hours earlier, Cassandra had made her demands and threats. Would you like some coffee? I think there's still some of that apple cake you like. Coffee sounds good. Michael settled into his father's old recliner, a choice that struck Josephine as significant. He'd always preferred the sofa during family gatherings, leaving Robert's chair empty out of respect. Tonight, he seemed to need the authority that chair represented. As Josephine prepared the coffee, she could feel Michael's eyes following her movements. There was something different in his attention, not the casual affection of a routine visit, but the careful observation of someone looking for signs of something specific. "So?" she said, settling across from him with 2 steaming mugs. "What brings you by, really?" Michael's face colored slightly. He'd never been good at deception, a quality that had made him an excellent child and a predictable adult. "I had a call from Cassie earlier. She mentioned you two had a conversation about some family matters." "We did." Josephine kept her voice neutral, giving him space to reveal how the conversation had been framed. "She's concerned about you, Mom. About how you're handling things since Dad's death. The isolation, the responsibility of managing everything alone." Michael's words had a rehearsed quality, as if he'd practiced them during the drive over. "And what specific concerns did she share?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Well, practical things. Security, insurance, making sure valuable items are properly protected. She mentioned Dad's grandmother's ring specifically. There it was, the careful reframing that made Cassandra's demand sound like reasonable concern for Josephine's welfare. And what did she tell you about our conversation regarding the ring? That you became defensive about it, maybe a little irrational." Michael's voice carried reluctance, as if he didn't quite believe the words, even as he spoke them. "She thinks the stress of everything might be affecting your judgment about practical matters." Josephine set down her coffee mug with deliberate care. "Michael, do you think my judgment is impaired?" The direct question seemed to catch him off guard. No. I don't know. You seem fine to me, but Cassie knows about these things. She's good at noticing when people are struggling." "What things does she know about?" "Psychology, I guess. Human behavior. She's always been good at reading people, understanding when they need help even if they don't realize it themselves." Josephine recognized the careful rebranding of manipulation as insight, of control as care. But she also heard something else in Michael's voice, a lack of conviction that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Would you like to see your father's letter about the ring?" she asked quietly. Michael blinked. "What letter?" "The one he wrote during his final week, specifying his wishes about family heirlooms. Specifically about the ring." Cassie didn't mention a letter. Josephine rose and retrieved the wooden box from upstairs, Michael following her with his eyes as she moved with calm purpose. When she returned, she placed the letter in his hands without comment. Michael read silently, his expression shifting from confusion to surprise, to something deeper and more troubled. When he finished, he read it again, his fingers tracing over his father's familiar handwriting. "He specifically says the choice about what happens to it is yours alone," Michael said finally. "Yes. And that you shouldn't let anyone pressure you into decisions about things that matter to you." "That's right." Michael was quiet for a long moment, the letter still in his hands. It's like he knew this conversation would happen. "Your father was a wise man. He understood people, understood family dynamics." Josephine settled back into her chair. "He also understood me better than I sometimes understood myself. Cassie said the ring has been in Dad's family for generations, that it should go to the next generation now. The ring did belong to your father's grandmother, Margaret. But Michael, it was given to me as a wedding gift 45 years ago. Your father placed it on my finger and promised me it was mine to keep. Every anniversary, every birthday, every milestone of our marriage, he would touch this ring and remind me of that promise." Michael looked down at his hands, and Josephine could see the wheels turning in his mind. "I never knew the history. About great-grandmother Margaret, about how long it's been in the family. There's a lot of family history that gets lost if we don't share it. Your great-grandmother Margaret was a remarkable woman. She came to America from Ireland with nothing but the clothes on her back and the ring on her finger. She worked in textile mills to support her family, kept that ring through the Depression when they could have sold it for food money. Why didn't Dad ever tell me these stories?" "He tried, sweetheart. But you were always so busy with work, with keeping peace in your own household. There never seemed to be time for old stories about dead relatives. The gentle rebuke hit its mark. Michael's face flushed with recognition and regret. I should have made time. The important thing is that you're here now, listening now. Josephine leaned forward, her voice taking on a strength that surprised them both. This ring represents 4 generations of women who wore it with pride, who passed it down with love and trust. Margaret to Helen, Helen to me. When the time comes, if the time comes, I'll decide who receives that trust next. But Cassie thinks a lot of things, Michael. But what do you think? Sitting here, in your father's chair, knowing what his actual wishes were, what do you think is right? It was perhaps the first time in years that anyone had asked Michael what he thought about a family matter, without immediately telling him what the correct answer should be. The question seemed to unlock something in him that had been carefully contained. I think Dad knew what he was doing when he wrote that letter, Michael said slowly. And I think if he'd wanted the ring to automatically go to me or to Grace, he would have said so. Yes. But Cassie is going to be furious if I don't support her on this. The admission hung between them, revealing the central tension in Michael's life. The constant calculus of keeping his wife happy versus doing what he believed was right. And if you do support her, if you pressure me to give up something your father specifically said was mine to keep. Michael met her eyes for the first time since arriving. Then I'd be going against Dad's wishes and your rights, just to avoid a fight at home. Yes. That's not the kind of man Dad raised me to be. No, it's not. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of recognition settling between them. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice carrying a heaviness that hadn't been there when he arrived. How long has she been like this? Cassie, I mean. How long has she been manipulating situations to get what she wants? Josephine chose her words carefully. People have different ways of getting their needs met, sweetheart. Some ask directly, some negotiate, some find more indirect approaches. That's not what I asked. The directness in his voice surprised her. This was the most assertive she'd seen Michael in years. Since the beginning, she said gently. But it's gotten more sophisticated over time. More systematic. And I've been helping her do it. All these years, I've been choosing the easy piece over actually standing up for what's right. You've been trying to keep your family together. That's not a terrible instinct. But it is if I'm enabling behavior that hurts other people. If I'm letting her run roughshod over you, over Grace, over anyone who doesn't give her what she wants. The recognition in his voice was painful to hear. Josephine watched her son grapple with the reality of his marriage. With his own role in perpetuating dynamics he was only now beginning to see clearly. What do I do now? Michael asked, and for a moment he sounded like the young boy who used to come to her with scraped knees and hurt feelings. You decide what kind of man you want to be going forward, and then you act like that man, regardless of who likes it or doesn't like it. Michael nodded slowly, his fingers still tracing the edges of his father's letter. She's going to say you've turned me against her. Probably. She's going to escalate this. Make it bigger. Involve more people. Try to get Sarah and David on her side by making them think you're losing your mental faculties. Almost certainly. And she's going to make my life hell at home until I fall back in line. Very likely. Michael looked around the living room where he'd grown up, where family dinners and birthday parties and quiet Sunday afternoons had shaped his understanding of what love looked like. His gaze lingered on the mantelpiece where 45 years of family photos told the story of a marriage built on respect and partnership. Dad never gave in to her, did he? All those times when she'd push for something or try to manipulate a situation, he never budged. Your father was very clear about his boundaries. He was polite, he was kind, but he didn't negotiate on matters of principle. And she respected that? She learned to work around it. But she never stopped testing, never stopped looking for leverage. Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the garden where Robert had spent so many peaceful hours. I've been such a coward. You've been a man trying to keep peace in his household. But Michael, there's a difference between maintaining harmony and enabling harmful behavior. I know that now." He turned back to face her, and Josephine saw something in his expression that reminded her powerfully of Robert, a quiet determination that suggested he'd made a decision and would stick to it regardless of the consequences. "I'm going to support you on this, Mom. The ring stays with you, just like Dad wanted, and if Cassie doesn't like it, that's something she and I will need to work out. Are you prepared for what that's going to cost you?" Michael's smile was sad but genuine. "Yeah, I think I am, and honestly, it's probably past time I paid it." As he prepared to leave, Michael paused at the door. "Mom, I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was really going on. And I'm sorry you've had to deal with this alone. You're seeing it now. That's what matters." After his taillights disappeared down the street, Josephine sat in the quiet house and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The battle wasn't over, and she knew Cassandra's next moves would be more aggressive, more calculated. But she was no longer fighting alone. Her son had chosen to be the man his father raised him to be. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Michael's Honda was barely out of the driveway when Cassandra's phone began its work. She sat in her pristine kitchen, a cup of chamomile tea cooling beside her as she scrolled through her contacts with the methodical precision of a general planning a campaign. Grace was upstairs doing homework, and the house was quiet enough for the kind of conversations that required careful tone management. Her first call was to Michael's cousin Linda, who lived 3 towns over and had always harbored a slight resentment toward Josephine's close-knit family. Linda answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the eager curiosity of someone who rarely received calls that promised interesting gossip. "Cassandra! How lovely to hear from you. How are you holding up? It must be so difficult, dealing with all the family dynamics after Robert's passing." "Actually, that's why I'm calling." Cassandra's voice carried just the right note of reluctant concern. "I'm worried about Josephine, Linda. Really worried. The isolation, the grief, I think it's affecting her more than any of us realized." "Oh no, what do you mean?" "Well, I stopped by today to check on her, and she became very agitated about some family heirlooms. Paranoid almost. She seemed to think I was trying to take things from her, when all I was suggesting was that valuable items should be properly secured and insured." Cassandra let the implication hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "She's become very possessive about Robert's grandmother's ring. Almost obsessive. When I mentioned that it might be wise to have it appraised for insurance purposes, she accused me of trying to steal it." "That doesn't sound like Josephine at all." "That's exactly what worries me. It's so unlike her. But grief can do strange things to people, especially older people, who are suddenly living alone. The isolation, the stress of managing everything by herself, I think it's taking a toll on her judgment." Linda made sympathetic noises, and Cassandra could practically hear her mental wheels turning, filing away this information for future use. "Have you talked to Michael about this?" "I have, and he's concerned too. But he's hesitant to intervene. You know how he is about confrontation. And Sarah lives so far away, she only sees Josephine at her best during short visits. She doesn't see the day-to-day signs of decline." "Decline?" Cassandra paused, as if reluctant to voice her concerns. "Memory issues, paranoid thoughts about family members, irrational attachment to material possessions, classic early signs of, well, you know, age-related cognitive changes." The phrase was carefully chosen, clinical enough to sound authoritative, vague enough to avoid making specific claims that could be challenged. 3 miles away, Josephine was washing the dinner dishes when she heard the gentle knock that signaled Pat's return. Through the kitchen window, she could see her friend's silhouette on the back porch. "How did it go with Michael?" Pat asked as she slipped inside. "Better than I hoped. He read Robert's letter, and I think he finally understood what's been happening. He's going to support me." Pat's eyebrows rose. That's wonderful news, and probably the last thing Cassandra expected. Which means she's going to escalate. Probably already has. Women like Cassandra don't waste time when their initial strategies fail. As if to prove Pat's point, Cassandra was already dialing her second number. Robert's sister Margaret, who lived in Florida and maintained sporadic contact with the Connecticut branch of the family. "Margaret, it's Cassandra. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Cassandra, what a surprise. How is everyone doing up there?" "Well, that's actually why I'm calling. I'm concerned about Josephine. Have you spoken with her recently?" "Not for a few weeks. Last time we talked, she seemed to be doing as well as could be expected. I'm afraid things have changed. The isolation is really taking its toll. She's becoming very suspicious of family members, very defensive about money and possessions. When I suggested she might want to review her insurance coverage, she became almost hostile." Cassandra's version of events was evolving with each telling, becoming more dramatic, more concerning. Margaret made worried sounds. "That's so unlike her. Josephine has always been the most reasonable person in the family." "That's what makes this so heartbreaking. Grief can change people, especially when they're isolated and trying to manage everything alone. I think she needs more support than she's willing to admit, but she's becoming resistant to offers of help." The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Josephine's mood as she prepared for her weekly grocery shopping trip. The Maple Street Market had been her regular stop for 20 years, and the familiar routine usually brought comfort. But today, something felt different from the moment she walked through the automatic doors. Mrs. Patterson, who normally chatted about her grandchildren while they waited in the checkout line, offered only a tentative smile and concerned nod. The young man who usually helped load groceries into cars approached with the careful solicitude reserved for the elderly and fragile. "Can I help you to your car, ma'am?" he asked, his tone gentler than usual. "I'm fine, thank you," Josephine replied, but she noticed the way his eyes lingered on her face, as if searching for signs of confusion or distress. At the church bulletin board, where she'd stopped to check the schedule for the Wednesday evening book club, Eleanor Hartley approached with the overly bright smile people used when they were worried about someone's mental state. "Josephine, dear, how are you holding up? We've all been so concerned about you." "I'm doing well, thank you." Of course. But if you ever need anything at all, you just call, okay? Sometimes when we're grieving, we don't realize how much help we need." The conversation had an odd, careful quality, as if Eleanor was following a script. When Josephine mentioned that she was looking forward to the book club meeting, Eleanor's expression became almost painfully sympathetic. "Oh, honey, maybe you should take some more time before jumping back into activities. Grief affects us in ways we don't always recognize. Sometimes it's better to take things slowly, let family help with decisions about what's best." By the time Josephine returned home, a cold certainty had settled in her stomach. The careful concern, the gentle suggestions about needing help, the subtle implications about her judgment, they all pointed to a coordinated campaign of whispers and worried conversations. Her phone was ringing as she set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. "Mom?" Sarah's voice carried a tension that immediately put Josephine on alert. "I just got off the phone with cousin Linda, and I need to ask you something directly. Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" "What did Linda tell you?" "That Cassandra is worried about your mental state, that you've become paranoid and suspicious, that you're making poor decisions about money and valuables. She said you accused Cassandra of trying to steal from you." Josephine sank into a kitchen chair, feeling the weight of what she was up against. "And what do you think?" "I think Linda has always been a gossip who enjoys drama." "But Mom," she sounded genuinely concerned. "She said Cassandra mentioned memory issues, cognitive decline." "Sarah." Josephine's voice carried a firmness that cut through her daughter's worry. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. My mind is completely clear. Cassandra demanded that I give her Robert's grandmother's ring, claiming that dead people don't need jewelry. When I refused, she became angry and threatened to involve the family in concerns about my judgment." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "She demanded the ring?" "Yesterday afternoon. She arrived with grace, initially appearing supportive, then gradually worked the conversation around to family heirlooms and practical estate decisions. When I refused to give her the ring, she suggested I wasn't thinking clearly due to grief." "Jesus Christ!" Sarah's voice carried a fury that was almost comforting in its intensity. "She's trying to gaslight you into thinking you're losing your mind so she can get her hands on family valuables. That's my assessment as well. Mom, this is serious. If she's calling extended family with concerns about your mental state, she's laying groundwork for something bigger. Maybe a competency challenge, maybe just a sustained campaign to isolate you from support. Josephine felt a chill run down her spine. Michael was here last night. He read your father's letter about the ring, and he's supporting my decision to keep it. I think that's why she's escalating. Good for Michael. Finally found his backbone. But Mom, you need to document everything. Every conversation, every phone call, every incident. If this goes legal, and it might, you'll need a paper trail. That afternoon, Cassandra's phone campaign continued with surgical precision. She called the pastor of Josephine's church, expressing concern about an elderly parishioner who seemed to be struggling with paranoid thoughts. She contacted the president of the local garden club, wondering if anyone had noticed changes in Josephine's behavior during meetings. Each conversation was carefully calibrated, enough concern to plant seeds of doubt, not enough specificity to be challenged or verified. The conversations always followed the same pattern: expressions of reluctance to voice concerns, emphasis on how unlike Josephine this behavior was, gentle suggestions that grief and isolation were taking their toll, and carefully planted phrases about memory issues and poor judgment. By evening, a network of whispered concerns was spreading through Josephine's social circle like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Most people wanted to help, wanted to show support for a neighbor they'd known and respected for decades. But Cassandra's narrative was compelling in its apparent reasonableness. Of course, grief could affect judgment. Of course, isolation could lead to paranoid thoughts. Of course, family members would be concerned about an elderly widow's well-being. Josephine spent the evening making her own phone calls, reaching out to close friends to gauge how far the poison had spread. The conversations were enlightening and disturbing in equal measure. People who'd known her for decades were suddenly asking careful questions about how she was really doing, whether she was taking care of herself, whether she might need more support than she was willing to admit. The most painful call was to her longtime book club leader, who gently suggested that Josephine might want to take a break from activities until she felt more like herself. The implication that she wasn't currently herself hung heavy in the air. As she prepared for bed, Josephine realized the true brilliance of Cassandra's strategy. By positioning herself as the concerned family member trying to help, she'd made it almost impossible for Josephine to defend herself without seeming paranoid and defensive, exactly the kind of behavior that would confirm the narrative of cognitive decline. But Cassandra had made one critical miscalculation. She'd underestimated the strength of the bonds Josephine had built over 45 years in this community. And she'd overplayed her hand with people who knew Josephine's true character. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. But Josephine was no longer fighting alone, and she had weapons Cassandra didn't know about: truth, documentation, and the fierce protective instincts of a daughter who'd finally seen through the manipulation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Josephine felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the cold, clear satisfaction of understanding her enemy completely. The gloves were off, and the real battle was about to begin. Sarah's silver Subaru pulled into the driveway at 8:30 Saturday morning, followed immediately by David's practical Honda. Josephine watched from the kitchen window as her daughter emerged with the purposeful stride of someone who'd driven 2 hours fueled by righteous anger. David followed more slowly, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of a man prepared for serious business. "Mom." Sarah's embrace was fierce and protective. "We're here to figure out exactly what we're dealing with and how to fight it." David's greeting was quieter, but no less supportive. "Josephine, I hope you don't mind me joining Sarah. Sometimes an outside perspective can be helpful in situations like this." They settled around the kitchen table where Josephine had shared so many family meals, but this felt different, more like a war council than a social visit. Sarah pulled out a yellow legal pad while David opened his portfolio to reveal printed emails and a small digital recorder. "I spent yesterday making calls," Sarah began. "Linda, Margaret, Eleanor from church, the grocery store manager, even Pastor Williams. I wanted to understand the scope of what Cassandra's been doing." "And?" Josephine asked, though she suspected she already knew. It's systematic. Every conversation follows the same pattern. Reluctant concern about your mental state, emphasis on how, unlike you, this behavior is, suggestions that grief and isolation are affecting your judgment. She's been very careful never to make specific accusations, just plant seeds of doubt. David leaned forward. From a strategic standpoint, it's actually quite sophisticated. She's created a narrative that makes it almost impossible for you to defend yourself without appearing to confirm the very behavior she's describing. Paranoid and defensive, Josephine said quietly. Exactly. But she made one critical error. She overestimated how much people would believe these claims without evidence, and she underestimated the loyalty you've built in this community over 45 years. Sarah consulted her notes. Pastor Williams was the most revealing conversation. He said Cassandra called expressing concern about an elderly parishioner, showing signs of cognitive decline, but when he asked for specifics, she couldn't provide any. He's known you for 15 years, Mom. He's not buying it. Eleanor from the garden club was suspicious too, David added. She said the whole conversation felt rehearsed, like Cassandra was following a script. That's when I realized we might be dealing with someone who's done this before. A knock at the front door interrupted them. Through the window, Josephine could see Grace standing on the porch, her young face set with determination. But there was something else in her posture, a nervousness that suggested this visit required courage. Grace, sweetheart? Josephine opened the door to find her granddaughter holding a small backpack and looking over her shoulder as if checking to see if she'd been followed. Grandma Jo, I need to talk to you. About Mom, about what she's been doing. Grace's voice carried a tremor that made her seem younger than her 16 years. I told her I was going to study at the library. Sarah and David exchanged glances as Grace joined them at the table. The teenager's presence changed the dynamic immediately. This was no longer just about adult family politics, but about a young person being forced to choose between loyalty and conscience. Grace, honey, you don't have to, Josephine began. Yes, I do. Grace's voice strengthened. What Mom did was wrong. What she's still doing is wrong. And I can't just sit there and pretend I don't see it. Sarah leaned forward gently. What have you seen, Grace? The phone calls. So many phone calls. She has a list. Relatives, church people, neighbors. She practices what she's going to say, writes down talking points about, concerning behaviors, and cognitive decline. She even looked up symptoms of dementia online to make her story sound more believable. David was taking notes, his expression growing more serious. How long has this been going on? Since Wednesday night, after Dad came home from his visit here. She was furious that he supported Grandma Jo about the ring. She said something about people not understanding the bigger picture and how sometimes you have to help people see what's really going on. Josephine felt a chill at the calculated nature of what Grace was describing. What else did she say? Grace hesitated, clearly struggling with the decision to reveal family secrets. She said elderly people sometimes don't realize when they're losing their mental faculties, and that family has a responsibility to step in before they make decisions that hurt everyone. She said if Grandma Jo won't listen to reason, then maybe she needs to understand that her judgment isn't as good as she thinks it is. She said this in front of you. Sarah's voice carried barely controlled anger. Not exactly. I heard her talking to someone on the phone. I don't know who. But she's been different since this whole thing started. Colder. More calculating. And she's been pressuring Dad to be more aggressive about the ring situation. How has your father responded? David asked. That's the thing. Dad's been pushing back. He told her about great-great-grandmother Margaret, about the letter from Grandpa Robert. He said the ring belongs to Grandma Jo, period. Mom didn't take that well. Grace pulled out her phone and showed them a series of text messages. She's been texting people all morning. Look, the messages were masterpieces of manipulation, expressions of family concern about an elderly relative who might need more support than she was willing to accept. Gentle suggestions that isolation and grief were taking their toll, carefully worded requests for people to keep an eye on Josephine during community interactions. "She's building a case," David said grimly, "creating a paper trail of documented concerns from multiple sources. If she ever wanted to challenge your competency legally, she'd have witnesses lined up to testify about your declining mental state." "Can she do that?" Josephine asked. "It's difficult, but not impossible. If she could get a few people to sign affidavits about concerning behavior, if she could document instances of poor judgment or confusion, a competency hearing becomes a real possibility." Pat's voice called from the back door. "Anyone home? I brought reinforcements." She entered with Janet Morrison from the book club and Helen Clark from the church volunteer committee, two women Josephine had known for over 20 years. Both looked grimly determined. "We've been comparing notes," Pat announced without preamble, "about the phone calls, the concerned questions, the suggestions that you might need. More support. Janet and Helen have something to tell you." Janet spoke first. "Yesterday I got a call from someone claiming to be conducting a wellness check on elderly community members. Very official sounding. They asked specific questions about your behavior at book club, whether I'd noticed memory issues or confusion. I hung up when I realized what was happening." Helen nodded. "Similar call, but they claimed to be from the church's senior services committee. Asked about your participation in activities, whether I'd observed any, concerning changes in your demeanor. When I asked for a callback number, they gave me some runaround about privacy policies." "Fake wellness checks," David said, making notes. "That's escalation. She's trying to create official-sounding documentation of community concerns." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it and her expression darkened. "It's from Michael. Cassandra's called a family meeting for tomorrow afternoon. She's telling people it's to discuss Mom's living situation and support needs. Without consulting you," Pat observed. "Making decisions about you without your input or consent." Josephine felt the weight of what they were facing. The systematic nature of the attack, the careful construction of a narrative designed to strip away her autonomy and dignity. But she also felt something else, the strength that came from being surrounded by people who knew her true character, who were willing to fight for her. "What do we do?" she asked. David closed his portfolio with decisive snap. "We document everything. We gather our own witnesses. And we go on the offensive. Cassandra's been playing a game where she controls the narrative. Time to change the rules." The battle lines were drawn, and Josephine was no longer fighting alone. But as Sunday afternoon approached, the weight of what was coming settled over her like a shroud. Cassandra had chosen the meeting location carefully, the community room at the local library, neutral ground that would make her appear reasonable, while subtly reinforcing the narrative that Josephine needed intervention from concerned family members. Sarah and David had spent the morning preparing their own documentation. David's architectural training served him well as he organized timelines, printed email screenshots, and prepared a folder of evidence that told a very different story than the one Cassandra had been crafting. "Remember," he told Josephine as they walked into the library, "she's expecting you to be defensive and emotional. Don't give her that satisfaction. We have facts, we have witnesses, and we have the truth." The community room felt sterile under the fluorescent lights. Cassandra had arrived early and arranged the chairs in a circle that positioned her as the natural facilitator. She wore a navy blue dress that suggested both respectability and mourning, her expression carefully composed to convey reluctant concern. Michael sat beside his wife, but there was something different in his posture, a distance that hadn't been there before. Grace occupied a chair near the back, her teenage face set with determination that made her look older than her 16 years. Margaret had driven up from Florida, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her manner suggesting someone who'd been briefed on the gravity of the situation. Linda sat near her, practically vibrating with anticipation for family drama. Several church ladies filled out the circle, their faces wearing the expression of people who genuinely believed they were there to help. Pat entered last, her presence immediately shifting the room's energy. She'd taught half these people at various points in their lives, and her authority was unquestioned. Thank you all for coming. Cassandra began, her voice carrying practiced warmth. I know this is difficult, but sometimes families need to have hard conversations. We're here because we're concerned about Josephine's well-being and her ability to make decisions that are in her best interest. Sarah's voice cut through the careful preamble. Actually, we're here because you've been conducting a systematic campaign to undermine our mother's reputation and competency in order to pressure her into giving you valuable family property. The directness of the accusation sent ripples through the room. Several people shifted uncomfortably, while Cassandra's composed expression flickered for just a moment. Sarah, I understand you're protective of your mother, but let me finish. Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing medical crises. David, would you please read the timeline we've prepared? David opened his folder with deliberate calm. Wednesday afternoon. Cassandra visits Josephine and demands Robert's grandmother's ring, stating that dead people don't need jewelry. When refused, she makes veiled threats about Josephine's mental state. Wednesday evening through Friday, Cassandra makes systematic phone calls to family members and community contacts, expressing manufactured concerns about Josephine's cognitive abilities and judgment. That's not, Cassandra began, but David continued reading. Saturday morning. Attempts are made to conduct fake wellness checks on Josephine, with callers claiming to represent official organizations. Saturday afternoon. Cassandra schedules this meeting to address Josephine's living situation and support needs, without consulting Josephine herself. Margaret looked confused. Fake wellness checks? Cassandra, what is he talking about? It's a misunderstanding. People are concerned about Josephine's isolation, her ability to manage. Mom! Grace's voice cut through the room like a knife. The teenager stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. Tell them about the list. Grace, sit down. Adults are talking. I am talking. Grace pulled out her phone. Tell them about the list of people to call. Tell them about the script you wrote with talking points about, concerning behaviors, and cognitive decline. Tell them about how you looked up symptoms of dementia online to make your story more believable. The silence that followed was deafening. Cassandra's carefully constructed facade began to crack around the edges. Grace is confused. She's a teenager dealing with family stress. I recorded some of your phone calls. Grace's voice was quiet but clear. The ones where you told people Grandma Jo was showing signs of mental deterioration. The ones where you said she was becoming paranoid and defensive. I can play them if you want. Michael's face had gone white. You recorded conversations without telling people? I recorded lies being told about my grandmother. Grace's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't just sit there and watch her destroy Grandma Jo's reputation because she wants a ring that doesn't belong to her. Cassandra stood abruptly, her control finally snapping. That ring belonged to Robert's family for 3 generations. It should go to the next generation, not sit on the finger of some old woman who's living in the past. The mask was completely off now, revealing the entitled fury that had been simmering beneath the surface. Some old woman? Pat's voice carried the ice of 3 decades spent dealing with bullies. That old woman is your husband's mother, and that ring was given to her by her husband with explicit instructions about its future. Instructions that were made when he was dying and probably not thinking clearly. Actually, Michael said quietly, I have Dad's letter right here. He pulled the folded paper from his jacket pocket, his hands steady despite the tension radiating from his wife. Would you like me to read it aloud? The part where he specifically says the ring belongs to Mom completely and forever, and that the choice of what happens to it next is hers alone to make? Michael. Cassandra's voice carried a warning that had probably worked for years. You don't understand the bigger picture here. I understand that you've been lying to me about what happened with Mom. I understand that you've been calling family members and spreading rumors about her mental state. And I understand that you've been teaching our daughter that manipulation is an acceptable way to get what you want. The room watched in fascination as 15 years of carefully managed family dynamics crumbled in real time. This is ridiculous. Cassandra gathered her purse, her dignity in tatters. I was trying to look out for everyone's interests. trying to prevent an elderly woman from making poor decisions that would affect the whole family's future. "No," Josephine said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Her voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority. "You were trying to steal from me. You were trying to destroy my reputation and my relationships, so you could take something that doesn't belong to you. And when that didn't work, you decided to convince everyone that I was mentally incompetent." She stood, and the room's attention focused on her completely. "For 45 years, I wore this ring as a symbol of my marriage to a good man who loved me and trusted my judgment. He made his wishes clear in writing. The ring stays with me, period." "Fine." Cassandra's voice was bitter with defeat. "Keep your precious ring, but don't expect this family to pretend everything is normal after this." "Cassandra." Michael's voice stopped her at the door. "We need to talk. At home. About a lot of things." As people began to file out, many stopping to embrace Josephine and offer quiet words of support, Pat remained behind to help clean up. "That could have gone worse," she observed. "It's not over," Josephine replied, watching through the window as Cassandra stalked to her car with Michael trailing behind, his shoulders set with new determination. "But at least now everyone knows what we're really dealing with." Grace appeared at her elbow, still tearful but somehow lighter. "Grandma Jo, I'm sorry it took me so long to speak up." Josephine pulled her granddaughter into a fierce embrace. "You spoke up when it mattered most. That took real courage." Through the window, they watched Cassandra's BMW peel out of the parking lot while Michael stood beside his own car, phone pressed to his ear, clearly calling someone. The truth was finally out, but Josephine suspected the real consequences were just beginning. 3 days passed in an uneasy quiet that felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. Josephine found herself moving through her daily routines with heightened awareness, checking the locks on her doors, noting every car that passed slowly down Maple Street. The confrontation at the library had stripped away any pretense of civility, and she knew Cassandra well enough to understand that exposure wouldn't lead to retreat. It would lead to escalation. Michael had called twice, his voice carrying a weariness that made him sound older than his 40 years. The conversations with Cassandra weren't going well. She alternated between furious accusations about family betrayal and tearful pleas about being misunderstood. Grace was staying with Sarah and David for the week, ostensibly to help with college preparation, but really to escape the toxic atmosphere at home. On Wednesday evening, as Josephine tended to Robert's roses in the fading light, she heard the familiar purr of Cassandra's BMW pulling into the driveway. This time, however, Cassandra emerged alone, her usual polished appearance slightly disheveled. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her makeup imperfect, and there was something wild around the edges that made Josephine's pulse quicken. "We need to talk." Cassandra's voice carried across the garden, pitched higher than usual. Josephine straightened slowly, her gardening gloves still dirty with soil, and faced her daughter-in-law across the lawn that Robert had mowed every Saturday for 20 years. "I think we've said everything that needs saying." "No, we haven't." Cassandra moved closer, her heels clicking against the flagstone path with staccato urgency. "You've destroyed my marriage, Josephine. You've turned my own daughter against me. You've made me look like some kind of monster in front of the entire community. I didn't do any of those things. You did them to yourself." Cassandra's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Did I? Or did I just make the mistake of trying to bring some practical thinking to a family that's perfectly content to let sentiment override common sense?" They stood 10 feet apart on the path Robert had built, and Josephine could see the desperation beginning to crack through Cassandra's carefully maintained facade. This wasn't the calculated manipulator who'd orchestrated phone campaigns and family meetings. This was someone whose world was falling apart, and that made her more dangerous, not less. "Michael won't even speak to me unless I apologize to you," Cassandra continued, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "Grace looks at me like I'm some kind of stranger. All because you couldn't be reasonable about a piece of jewelry that's just gonna sit in a box when you die anyway." "It's not about the jewelry." "Of course it's about the jewelry. Everything else is just emotional manipulation designed to make me look bad for thinking practically about the family's future." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Josephine felt something crystallize in her chest. A clarity about who she was dealing with and what this moment really represented. "No," she said quietly. "It's about respect. It's about my right to make decisions about my own possessions, my own life, my own relationships. It's about the fact that you think you're entitled to override my wishes, manipulate my family, and destroy my reputation in service of getting what you want." Cassandra took another step closer, and Josephine could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. Whether from genuine emotion or calculated effect, it was impossible to tell. "I never meant for things to go this far. I was trying to secure Grace's future, to make sure valuable family heirlooms stayed in the family where they belong. Is that really so terrible? What's terrible is that you lied about my mental state to anyone who would listen. What's terrible is that you tried to convince my own family that I was incompetent. What's terrible is that you recorded fake wellness checks and tried to build a case for stripping away my autonomy. I was protecting the family's interests. You were serving your own interests." Josephine's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. "And when that didn't work, you decided to destroy me rather than accept that you couldn't have what you wanted." Cassandra's composure finally cracked completely. "Fine. You want the truth. That ring is worth more money than you'll ever need, sitting on the finger of someone who's just marking time until she joins her dead husband. Grace is young, she has her whole life ahead of her. She deserves something beautiful to mark the important moments in her future. But instead it's going to waste on someone who's already had her turn at happiness." The words were designed to wound, and they did. But they also revealed something Josephine had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. That Cassandra's sense of entitlement went far deeper than greed, extending to a fundamental belief that older people's lives had less value, less meaning, less right to joy or beauty. "You're right about one thing," Josephine said quietly. "I did have my turn at happiness. 45 years of it, with a man who loved me enough to trust my judgment even after his death. And part of that happiness was this ring, which represents every anniversary, every birthday, every quiet moment of contentment we shared." She pulled off her gardening gloves and held up her left hand, where the diamond caught the last rays of sunlight. "This ring will go to Grace someday, when she's ready for it, and when I choose to give it to her. But that choice is mine to make, and it will be made out of love, not manipulation. It will be given freely, not extracted through campaigns of lies and character assassination. When you die, it's going to go to her anyway. Why not give it to her now, when she can enjoy it, when it can actually make a difference in her life? Because Robert trusted me to make that decision. Because I've earned the right to wear my own wedding ring for as long as I choose. And because Grace deserves to receive it from someone who loves her, not someone who took it from someone else." Cassandra stared at her for a long moment, and Josephine could see the exact moment when desperation turned to fury. "This isn't over," Cassandra said, her voice dropping to something close to a hiss. "Michael can be romantic about family loyalty all he wants, but he's going to get tired of this conflict eventually. Grace can play the moral crusader, but she's 16 and she'll get distracted by other things. You're alone in that house, Josephine. You're getting older every day, and you have no idea how many people in this community still have questions about your judgment. Are you threatening me? I'm telling you the truth. This fight has cost me my marriage and my relationship with my daughter, but it's cost you something too. People are going to be watching you now, looking for signs that maybe I was right about your mental state after all. One confused moment at the grocery store, one forgotten appointment, one bill paid late, and all those doubts are going to come rushing back." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Josephine felt a chill run down her spine. But underneath the fear, something else burned bright and strong, a recognition that this was the moment she'd been building towards since that first refusal on the porch. "You're right," she said, her voice steady and clear. "People will be watching me. Which means they'll see an independent, competent woman making her own decisions and living her own life with dignity and purpose. They'll see someone who stood up to a bully and won. And every day that I prove you wrong will be another day that your credibility diminishes and your influence fades." She stepped closer to Cassandra, close enough to see the fear beginning to creep into her daughter-in-law's eyes. "Here's what's going to happen. Josephine continued. You're going to get in your car and drive away from my house. You're going to stop calling my friends and neighbors with concerns about my well-being. You're going to accept that the ring stays with me, period, end of discussion. And if you ever try to manipulate my family or my community again, I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are. You can't. I can, and I will. Because I'm not the grieving, accommodating widow you thought you could steamroll. I'm a woman who's lived in this community for 45 years, who's earned respect and built relationships that go deeper than your ability to poison them. And I'm done being polite to people who mistake kindness for weakness. Cassandra stared at her for a moment longer, and Josephine could see the recognition dawning that this was not a battle she could win, not a person she could break. This isn't over, Cassandra repeated, but the words lacked conviction now. Yes, Josephine said simply, it is. As Cassandra's BMW disappeared down the street for what felt like the final time, Josephine stood alone in her garden and felt something she hadn't experienced in months, complete peace with who she was and what she was capable of defending. The war was over, and she had won. The morning after Cassandra's final confrontation dawned crisp and clear, and Josephine woke with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt since Robert's death. For the first time in months, she'd slept through the night without waking to worry about what fresh manipulation might be brewing in her daughter-in-law's mind. The war was over, and the quiet that followed felt like genuine peace rather than the tense calm before another storm. But peace, she was learning, came with its own complications. Michael's Honda appeared in the driveway just after 9, followed by a small U-Haul trailer that told its own story. Josephine watched from the kitchen window as her son emerged slowly, his movements carrying the weight of someone who'd made a decision that would change everything. 2 suitcases and a box of personal items suggested this wasn't a brief cooling-off period. "Mom?" His voice carried across the porch as he knocked on the door she'd already opened. "I was wondering if I could stay here for a few days. Maybe longer. I need some time to think." "Of course." She stepped aside to let him enter, noting the exhaustion in his eyes and the careful way he held himself, as if moving too quickly might cause something fragile to shatter. "The guest room is ready whenever you need it." They sat in the living room where so much of the recent drama had unfolded, but now the space felt different, less like a battlefield and more like a sanctuary. Michael settled into his father's chair again, but this time the choice seemed less about claiming authority and more about seeking comfort from familiar surroundings. "She left," he said simply, "packed her bags last night and went to stay with her sister in Hartford. Said she needed space to figure out if this marriage was worth saving, given how her own family had turned against her." Josephine felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that the immediate threat was gone, sadness for her son's pain, and a grudging respect for Cassandra's strategic retreat. Even in defeat, she was managing to position herself as the wronged party. "I'm sorry this has been so hard on you." Michael's laugh was bitter. "Are you? Because honestly, Mom, I think this needed to happen. I think I needed to see who I'd become, what I'd been enabling all these years." Over the next few hours, as they shared coffee and the comfortable silence of people who'd known each other all their lives, the full scope of Michael's revelation began to emerge. It wasn't just about the ring, or even about Cassandra's manipulation campaign. It was about 15 years of small compromises, of choosing peace over principles, of gradually ceding his moral authority to someone who viewed relationships as power struggles to be won. "I keep thinking about Dad," Michael said as they worked together to prepare lunch. "How he never budged when Cassie tried to push him around. I always thought he was being stubborn, maybe even mean. But he was protecting something. His integrity, your dignity, the family's actual values, rather than the fake harmony she was always trying to create." The phone rang frequently throughout the day, but the calls brought surprising news. Word of the library confrontation had spread through their small community with the speed that only small towns could manage. But the reaction wasn't what anyone had expected. Eleanor from the church called to apologize for doubting Josephine's judgment and to express admiration for Grace's courage in speaking up. The garden club president left a voicemail expressing the organization's full support and extending an invitation for Josephine to speak at their next meeting about standing up to family manipulation. Even the grocery store manager called to clarify that his staff had been instructed to treat all customers with equal respect, regardless of any rumors they might have heard. Pat arrived in the afternoon with a thermos of soup and a satisfied expression. "Have you heard from Linda today?" "Not yet. Should I expect to?" "Oh, yes. Seems she got a very interesting call this morning from Margaret down in Florida. Turns out Margaret did some checking after Sunday's meeting, made a few calls to relatives who actually know Cassandra's family history." Pat settled into her usual spot on the porch with the air of someone who had particularly juicy information to share. "Did you know that Cassandra tried to pull something similar with her own grandmother's jewelry about 5 years ago? Before the old lady died, Cassandra was making noises about how certain pieces should be preserved for future generations rather than sitting unused in an elderly woman's jewelry box." Josephine felt a chill of recognition. "What happened?" "The grandmother changed her will, left everything to charity rather than deal with the pressure. Cassandra's own sister confirmed it when Margaret called to verify the story. The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't an isolated incident born of grief and financial stress, but a systematic approach to acquiring what Cassandra viewed as her rightful inheritance from older family members who were inconveniently still alive. Grace arrived just before dinner, her teenage energy filling the house with a lightness that had been missing for weeks. She'd driven herself over in the car Michael had bought her for her 16th birthday, and her confidence behind the wheel seemed to mirror a new maturity in other areas of her life. "Dad told me what happened," she said, settling cross-legged on the living room floor in the way that only teenagers could manage comfortably. "About Mom leaving. About him staying here. I want you to know I support his decision completely. Gracie, this is hard for everyone. Your mother is still your mother, no matter what's happened between us. I know that. But she's also someone who lied about her own family member, who tried to convince people you were mentally incompetent, who recorded fake wellness checks. That's not the person I want to be, and it's not the kind of behavior I want to enable by pretending it's okay." The maturity in Grace's voice was startling. At 16, she was already demonstrating the moral clarity that her father had taken 40 years to develop. Over dinner, they talked about practical matters. Grace's college applications, Michael's temporary living arrangements, the logistics of a family splitting apart. But underneath the mundane details, something larger was happening. 3 generations of the same family were learning to relate to each other as individuals with distinct values and boundaries, rather than as players in a system designed to maintain false harmony. "I've been thinking," Grace said as they cleared the dishes, "about the ring. About what it really represents." Josephine paused in her loading of the dishwasher. "What do you mean?" "When I was little, I used to love hearing Grandpa Robert tell the story about great-great-grandmother Margaret, how she kept that ring through the Depression and passed it down with such intention. But I never really understood what that meant until now." Grace leaned against the kitchen counter, her expression thoughtful. "It's not just about a piece of jewelry, is it? It's about the idea that some things can't be taken. They can only be given. And they can only be given by someone who truly owns them. Not just legally, but morally." "That's exactly right. So when Mom tried to pressure you into giving it up, she was trying to break something that took 4 generations to build. The trust, the continuity, the idea that love gets passed down through choices made freely rather than through manipulation or force." Michael looked up from drying dishes, his expression something between pride and amazement. "When did you get so wise?" "When I watched Grandma Jo refuse to be bullied and realized that's the kind of woman I want to become." That evening, after Grace had driven home and Michael had settled into the guest room with a stack of papers from work, Josephine found herself alone on the back porch where so much of this drama had begun. The garden that Robert had planted stretched before her in the gathering dusk, and she could almost feel his presence in the evening breeze. The ring on her finger caught the last rays of sunlight, sending small rainbows across the porch floorboards. But for the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about the ring as a symbol of loss or a target for others. Greed. Instead, she saw it as Robert had intended. A reminder of promises kept, of love freely given, of the trust that formed the foundation of authentic relationships. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "David and I have been talking. We want to do something special for Dad's first anniversary next month. A celebration of his life and your marriage. Maybe in the garden. What do you think?" The idea filled Josephine with warmth. A celebration rather than a memorial. A focus on life and love rather than loss and grief. It felt like the perfect way to mark not just Robert's memory, but her own transformation from a woman defined by loss to someone empowered by the strength she'd discovered in defending what mattered most. She typed back, "I think your father would love that. And I think I'm ready to start planning for the future rather than just protecting the past." As she prepared for bed, Josephine reflected on the costs and benefits of the battle she'd fought. Cassandra was gone, and with her the immediate threat to Josephine's autonomy and dignity. But the victory had come at a price. A family fractured, a marriage in crisis, relationships that would need to be rebuilt on entirely new foundations. Yet underneath the sadness for what had been lost, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The deep satisfaction that came from being fully, authentically herself. No more accommodating manipulative behavior to keep peace. No more swallowing her own needs to maintain false harmony. No more pretending that love meant accepting whatever treatment others chose to dish out. She was 68 years old, and she was finally learning that it was never too late to become the person she was meant to be, strong enough to set boundaries, wise enough to recognize manipulation, brave enough to fight for what mattered most. And tomorrow would bring new possibilities for building relationships based on respect rather than resignation, love rather than obligation, truth rather than the comfortable lies that had kept the peace for far too long. The ring remained on her finger, where it belonged, where it would stay until she chose otherwise. And that choice, that freedom to choose, was perhaps the most precious inheritance Robert had left her. 6 months later, the morning of Robert's first death anniversary dawned with the kind of gentle spring warmth that made everything seem possible. Josephine stood in her kitchen, looking out at the garden where she and Robert had spent so many peaceful hours together, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not the sharp grief she'd braced herself for, but a quiet sense of celebration for a life well lived and a love that continued to shape her choices. The backyard had been transformed over the past week. Sarah and David had strung lights through the trees Robert had planted 20 years ago. Pat had organized the neighborhood women into a cooking brigade that had produced enough food to feed a small army. Michael, who had officially filed for divorce 2 months earlier, had built a small platform near Robert's rose garden, where people could share memories. Grace emerged from the house carrying a stack of photo albums, her cap and gown from yesterday's graduation ceremony still hanging in the front closet. At 18, she moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned early that standing up for what's right sometimes comes with costs, but those costs were worth paying. "Grandma Jo, people are starting to arrive," she called out. Through the front window, Josephine could see cars beginning to line the street. Not just family, but neighbors who'd known Robert for decades, colleagues from his carpentry business, members of the church where they'd been married. The guest list had grown organically as word spread about the celebration, and what had started as a small family gathering had become something larger, a community's recognition of a love story that had touched many lives. Pat was the first to arrive, carrying a covered dish and wearing the navy blue dress she reserved for special occasions. Behind her came Eleanor from the church, Janet from the book club, and Helen from the volunteer committee, women who'd stood by Josephine during the worst of Cassandra's campaign and had remained steadfast allies in the months since. "How are you holding up?" Pat asked, settling the casserole on the kitchen counter with practiced efficiency. "Better than I expected," Josephine replied honestly. "I thought today would be about missing Robert. But it feels more like celebrating what we built together and what continues because of it." Sarah and David arrived with their teenagers, who immediately gravitated toward Grace with the easy affection of cousins who'd grown closer over the past challenging months. David carried a portfolio that contained something special, an architectural drawing he'd commissioned of the house as Robert had built it, complete with all the careful details that told the story of a craftsman's love for his family. Margaret had driven up from Florida, bringing with her a photo album that contained pictures of Robert's grandmother wearing the ring that had caused so much conflict. The images told their own story. Margaret at her wedding, at family gatherings, during quiet moments when the camera had caught her unaware. The ring looked different in those old photographs, not like a valuable object to be coveted, but like a natural part of a woman's hands as she lived her life. She would have loved Josephine, Margaret said quietly, looking through the album with Grace. Margaret always said the ring should go to someone who understood what marriage really meant. Not just the romance of it, but the daily choice to build something lasting together. Michael appeared at Josephine's elbow, carrying a folding chair and looking more at peace than she'd seen him in years. The divorce proceedings had been surprisingly amicable. Cassandra had gotten what she wanted in terms of financial settlement, and Michael had gotten his freedom from a relationship that had slowly eroded his sense of himself. "Mom, I want to say something during the memorial part," he said. "About Dad, but also about what this whole experience taught me about the kind of man I want to be. Of course. And I want to thank you for showing me that it's never too late to start living according to your values, instead of just trying to keep everyone else happy." As the afternoon unfolded, the backyard filled with the gentle buzz of conversation and laughter that marked the best kind of gathering. People shared stories about Robert's generosity, his craftsmanship, his quiet humor. But increasingly, the conversation turned to Josephine herself, her strength during the recent crisis, her grace under pressure, her transformation from accommodating widow to empowered woman. Grace stood to speak when the formal remembrance began, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the gathered community. "My grandfather Robert taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. He chose to love my grandmother through 45 years of marriage, and he chose to trust her judgment even after his death. That trust became the foundation for everything that followed." She paused, looking directly at Josephine. "But my grandmother taught me something equally important, that love doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment others choose to give you. Real love requires boundaries, honesty, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." When Michael spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "My father was a carpenter, and he built everything to last. This house, this garden, this family, all of it was constructed with intention and care. But the most important thing he built was the example of how to be a person of integrity, someone whose word could be trusted and whose love could be counted on." He looked at his mother with something approaching awe. "I spent too many years thinking that keeping peace meant avoiding conflict. But Mom showed me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to compromise your principles, even when it costs you relationships you thought you needed." As the formal remembrance concluded and people began to mingle again, Josephine found herself standing near Robert's rose garden with Grace, Margaret, and Sarah. The 4 generations of women represented different chapters in the ring's story, and there was something symbolic about their gathering in this spot where Robert had spent so many peaceful hours. "I've been thinking about the ring," Josephine said quietly, "about what should happen to it next." Grace looked startled. "Grandma Jo, you don't need to." "I want to, but not because anyone pressured me into it, and not because I'm tired of the responsibility, because it's time, and because I've learned the difference between giving something freely and having it taken from you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, not the ring itself, but something else. Inside was a delicate gold chain, simple and elegant. "This was Robert's wedding gift to me on our 25th anniversary. He said it was for the times when the ring felt too heavy, when I needed to carry our love close to my heart instead of on my hand." She fastened the chain around Grace's neck, the gold catching the late afternoon sunlight. "The ring stays with me for now, but this is yours, to remind you that love freely given is the only love worth having, and that the most precious things in life can't be demanded or manipulated. They can only be offered." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she touched the chain. "I'll treasure it always." "I know you will, and someday, when you're ready, when you've found someone who loves you the way your grandfather loved me, I'll give you the ring too. Not because you're entitled to it, but because you've shown me you understand what it really represents." As the sun began to set over the garden Robert had tended with such care, the gathering took on a golden quality that made everything seem touched with magic. People lingered, reluctant to end an afternoon that had been both memorial and celebration, both ending and beginning. Pat found Josephine as the last guests were preparing to leave. "You know what I think Robert would say if he could see all this?" "What?" "That you finally figured out the difference between being his widow and being yourself, and that he's proud as hell of the woman you've become." Josephine looked around at the garden filled with people who genuinely cared about her, at the family that had been rebuilt on foundations of honesty rather than false harmony, at the granddaughter who wore her gift with such grace and understanding. "I think he'd say the best marriages don't end when one person dies," she replied. "They transform into something new, a legacy of love that keeps growing, keeps influencing how people treat each other long after the original love story has become memory." The ring on her finger caught the last rays of sunlight, sending rainbows across the garden where Robert's roses bloomed in abundance. But for the first time since his death, Josephine wasn't thinking about endings. She was thinking about beginnings, about the woman she'd discovered herself to be, about the relationships she'd choose to nurture going forward, about the years ahead filled with possibility rather than mere survival. At 68, she was finally free to be exactly who she was meant to be. And that freedom, hard-won through months of standing her ground against manipulation and pressure, felt like the most precious gift Robert could have left her. The memorial had become a celebration, the ending had become a beginning, and the ring that had sparked so much conflict had become what it was always meant to be, a symbol of love freely given, carefully tended, and passed on when the time was right and the choice was freely made. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by those who truly loved her, Josephine Smith understood that some battles are worth fighting, and some victories change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,